당은도 가서 당은도 동해세 난 디기 주변에 또 저기 샘상한디기 파제바지 샘상을 예화하고 와지 되네 샘상을 상보디기 귤레께바나 디기에네 제보 간스 용어도 규간의 실례때 용기도 샘백이 제바제다 샘미삼 멤버지 귤레 모여송 샘 멤버디 모여송 되네 바 안디 멤버 텔라테네 나저 라신니가라 펜비기 제보 간스 용어도 네베 제보 간스 용어도 신내야 심주치야라 직 제고래 되네 자다 심주치네 소소라나기 지게 내서 하고도 되네 상배치 직디야 냠는지야다 아니 냠배치도 마빠야게 탑시지야 직 되네 제고래서지 가서 되네슈 안디 멤베게다 만족에 줍타 세디 줍타기 시 남예데 사지 손바 레베스네 아니 사지 손바 인세네 손바 레마레스 티와제 안디야 사지 손바 레세다 단 줍데기 되네 안 사지 손바이나 안 도카르레 띵고레 세지지다 티와 직제 안다 사 줍테기 안에 따위기 남샤 야체쇼다 되네기 처음은 세디게 삽케기 캐바디 안에 룽레 땡고레베스 안에 리발레 땡고레 세지 캐바디 간에 제고레 스비티와 직제 다 디네소 숨디 가사 디고르시제 안에다 디 가사시야 될다 산지기 줌데 남샤티게 산지 숨바레 세지 안 디바도 시사바레.
Good evening. So last night in our class, which encompassed a review of what we've been looking at thus far, I spoke about how, in order to achieve our yearn for happiness and a state of lasting, stable happiness that's free from any problem or difficulty at all, we need to look inward, look at our own minds, coming to differentiate those which are wholesome and those which are unwholesome. And the way that we recognize whether a particular consciousness can be classified as wholesome or unwholesome is through looking at the impact it has on us when it arises and the impact it has on others through its expression. And then thereafter, when we've recognized what's wholesome and unwholesome, we need to generate a strong determination through seeing the faults of unwholesome minds, a strong determination to abandon them, and through seeing the benefits of wholesome ways of thinking, a strong determination to cultivate them. And in dependence on that, we then look at the causes that lead to the arisal of wholesome ways of thinking and the causes that lead to the arisal of unwholesome ways of thinking. And with this knowledge gathered, we strive at ensuring that we eliminate the causes that lead to unwholesome ways of thinking and cultivate the causes that lead to wholesome ways of thinking. Here, what in brief one is doing is independence on knowledge. One is strengthening one's habituation to virtuous ways of thinking, and in proportion to that, weakening one's habituation to non-virtuous ways of thinking. Then, thereafter, the second point we looked at last night was establishing that the four Buddhist philosophical schools were taught by Buddha Shakyamuni himself. And then thirdly, we came to the question on page 3, which how one differentiates between these various tenets, whether they rely on scriptural authority or on reasoning in terms of their profundity, which is seen as superior and which are seen as intermediate and which are seen as beginning philosophical views. Is this brought about in dependence on scriptural authority or reasoning? So in brief, those were the 3 points we looked at last night.
Dadi chu sumginane dangbo da sanje sumba rebe sede sanje sumba rede kamda meba dushe sambata tumbe tone sumba rebe sede kasan di shu chabare da diring ma shuye di da ana dumda shigi tewe namsha di sanje lungle temba na lungkarele tingore se dode karele tingore se andigi an tingore se juwa yora digi da dode tingore se da gyumsa sheya chikche 다 름대기기 주대 따위 남샤 안에 지기 야체tion 초만다 안에 삽기 캐바디 안에 룬라 띵고르베 리벌 띵그레스 되는 남자 캐바디 간에 체고레스 비 룬라 띵고 리벌 띵고레스 야데 다디 안에 리벌 띵고레스 야지 어디디 고마셔야 되다
In terms of answering the question, we looked at the answer to the first part, which is that Buddha Shakyamuni did teach the four differing philosophical views, and this was established through explaining the reason why Buddha did so, that he taught in a particular view in dependence on the students that were before him, and in particular in dependence on their particular karmic background and individual spiritual disposition. The Buddha presented a philosophical view that would best suit them and lead them towards the accumulation of virtue and the abandonment of non-virtue. So because of the wide variety of ways of thinking amongst beings, the Buddha taught varying philosophical views. So that was the first part of the question that was answered last night. Now today we'll come to the second and then the third parts of the question. The second was, which sutras does each philosophical view primarily rely on? Because it's now been established that Buddha taught each philosophical view. So then which of Buddha's teachings, of his sutras, does each philosophical view primarily rely upon? And thereafter, we'll look at, so are these philosophical views, does one differentiate between them based on their superiority, their depth and status, in terms of scriptural authority or reasoning? So that will be then the second part that we look at today, which is the third and final part of this question.
Lama da denike mangbu duishe denike sumbi chu kholo rimba sumse dadi rimba sum di rimba sum de dangbo de kawa ko resene manzo Varanasi le warane sungsagi chu sungsagi ne di Varanasi che ane di ane dele kar somba de denshi namshege chu khodi dangbo ko chu dangbo ko wase chu khorji ko wale an di chela ane di chela kawa ko chu khorji ko wale kar ko kawa ko wale se ne di the Varanasi, the Minneapolis Varanasi, and Garsore, Baba Tini may be Chokor said, Odus and Chukolo, the Shersing Dosun at the Shazan, or dinner, and Sonsi and Chukolo, Chukolo in Nirosh. Baba Tini may be Chukolo also. Tini may was in a rushing in Maduba, Tombani, Tempe Chukolo, Tini Maduba Sigurua, Rangatini Maduba, Demba Maduba, Rashing Madu Chibarua, Jisandi. Sikdelia, Bawa Tini may be Chukolo, Sigore, the Varnasalia, Casore, a Jagopumborelia Govare. No.
Buddha Shakyamuni taught a vast number of sutras over his lifetime. These then are generally divided into three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The first turning, that the sutras included within the first turning of the wheel of Dharma were generally taught at Varanasi, and these encompassed the teachings on the Four Noble Truths. That was the first turning of the wheel. The second turning of the wheel of Dharma was the presentation on the Dharma of signlessness, or on emptiness. And these teachings were primarily taught at Vulture's Peak. So of the three wheel turnings, the first was at Varanasi, the second was at Vulture's Peak, and the first was primarily on the Four Noble Truths, and the second was on the Dharma of signlessness or emptiness.
Somebody sonsa ne de yang ba chen se de sonware jela ane kasore lebar number chewi ki chukyu kholo lebar number chewa di mare se ba nami gi chene ane lebar number chewa siguro.
The third wheel turning the third of the three, was taught at Vaishali, and this was on the topic of differentiating between aspects, or differentiating well between aspects.
콜로 다비에 갑라 송비 갑 대시 최고 송비 갑라 내내고 지 저기 템파시 송야 됩니다. 봐 동화 다음에 봐라서 봐 다음에 남샤 송고래 다음에 봐서 송고마다 대라 동반이다. 안에 지 라신이 마주 봐서 돼 송고 말에 다음에 봐서 송고로 봐 다음에 남샤 된 거를. 제가 내내자 디가서 송지 안에 최 지게 안에 랑이 천이 주바 여바조지 송고래지 여바조지 그 대가서는 디 두지기 사지기 최송야디 베네디스 가서리 멤비기 멘테디 멤버 코로나라요 말하시래 가서 매 야고치인다 맨 교고신다 디테에 가서 맨이 네바기 네들 뛴지네 네발에 네들 뛴지네 멘테고레스 세상 배딘 맨디 누버 첨보도 슉첨보를 해야지 제샤바네 근데 네바들은 마편받지 뇌냐가 여러와 제가 네고 코로나야 근데 사와로지 파와에는 코로나 사와자야기 매 베네 누버 충주로지 디파 제월마도 베네가 저기 배 지게 나서 슉첨보 자야기 매 슉첨보 된 베네 자하미 캔서 나지 맨로 슉첨보 디게 제샤바는 뉴핑교마 뉴교로와 제가 건 네비기 네들 뛰네 마멘 찍고 멘비기 된 찍고레스 멤버 캐바디 얘기 다 네기 고매 약도 가리네 고디 약아레선 찍고 말디 제가 디네자 안 델이야 안 네비기 네들 뛰인지 찍고 네벌 뛰인지는 가리 판도 체도 디 찍고레스 디나시 사지 유추 송야디야 메니기 두제 최 양가들 감당 메바당 코롱을 삼바 네 델이야 판도 가르치 가르든 디시네 판도 체 연구요 받 감당 메벌을 듣는 순골마도 디체디 배 야고 사브 삽게 시부르 사고 시부르 에서는 디 약쇼레서는 메니 송도나 안네 메니 가소레 메바다 안네 지게 닝도다 디자야기 니버르 메바나 콜 판도 연구 말와 디나신 안네 멘비기 네발 멘제바 네다 뛴지네 가르 판데지 멘제바 나시 상이 좀된디기 최 송야디야 메니 감 두지기 감나 메발 뛴지 코로나를 판도 가르도 동아세야다 디기도 판도 가르 연구도 디데네 또 디나시지 송고래지래 진 여반의 송바래지 어디
In the first turning of the wheel of Dharma at Varanasi, where the general topic of the Four Noble Truths was presented, within that were topics such as the sufferings of samsara, impermanence, and selflessness. These were what were presented. The Buddha, in these teachings, did not present the lack of inherent existence, that all phenomena lack inherent existence. In fact, his teachings were more in the direction that phenomena have signs, that there is some existence. And the reason that he taught in this way, we can perhaps understand through an analogy of a medical practitioner. So one can say that, for example, a doctor has limited freedom, or maybe even no freedom, in terms of what she prescribes, in that she is necessarily needs to prescribe medication that is related to the illness that the patient is afflicted with. If the doctor prescribes medication that is far too powerful for the illness, further harm will come to the patient. If she prescribes medication that is weak and ineffective against a severe illness, no benefit will come to the patient. So therefore, the doctor needs to act in accordance. The doctor is limited in how she can act because of the particular situation of the suffering being before her. So similarly, with the Buddha, when he turned the wheel of Dharma for the first time, he taught precisely in accordance with the specific personalities or karmic backgrounds of the beings before him. And therefore, he taught on the sufferings of samsara, impermanence, and selflessness, but not on the emptiness of true existence or the emptiness of inherent existence, because he taught precisely in accordance with the needs of the beings before him.
나즈 자극도 디나신 제셔라 고래지 러고르다 디네 아주 좋았을 미 가시게 된 러고르 제가 제가 그런 중 년마다 잡았네 다지 나즈 가가마 하고 말아 제가 미 멤버기 나즈 가가마 하고 원자 년마면디 차와나즈를 차와면 제르바 니베 나즈 샹다데 면 샹다 제거로와 제가 미디기 어디디 면디 뭐 년마 제거데 디레 슈고디 디레 제가 면디 나신 제셔라 고래
In the village in the area that I'm from, I've actually seen something similar to this, that when the villagers were ill and they went to see a doctor and the doctor prescribed medicine that healed their illness, then when they were later ill again, perhaps this time from a different illness, they would go back to the hospital and say, "This is the medicine that worked last time, I want the same medicine again." And if the doctor examined them and determined that actually their illness is now different from before, therefore this medication is not beneficial, the patient would refuse. They'd say, "I have faith in this medicine, it has worked for me, and I want the same medicine again."
디네 자다 나 콜로니비 값소 가르송으로서는 콜로니비 최 송두 갑라 다 셰싱의 동반이기 최담지 라신 마주베 남샤장 송고래 제산 딘데 송바데 대 송세기 체도 제외 두제디게 나야 냐마게 데 콜로 담비 코르사기 최고 코르사데 미디에 데스 최 송세데 뉴아여서와 제산 디지게 최 콜로데양 바직 데스 마소나 rimbal masona ko tes nga lobsan khasa sheba na ji lobjul masona ya thoram labra labkan na shin on shese ro masona ya chenbo yukan desol ya an so are deso sungdu kable ne an sangye jomne de bene nga zo kholo dangbo sangye jomne de kholo dambi warna sele chugi kholo ko kapla inge sangye jomne de dati gelongan na ba chen chen an chue so are gelong na ba che chuge na de dina shin chen so are 제가 와라나슬 셰싱에도 동반이 곳이 송두갑라 상여 주문인데 송야지 아주 제대 레이 넘버 제로시 레이 넘버 전전 안두고 디네게 난 델야 최년 망체다 주주여 받아 원시여 받아 똑바로 마서나 토부 고로래 되긴 이제 소리가 요소가 차고래 자그 공부를 네
The second turning of the wheel of Dharma at Vulture's Peak. Here then, Buddha did teach that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. There is each and every phenomenon lacks inherent existence. This he taught in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma at Vulture's Peak. So here, there were less people in his audience, and it was more of, to use last night's analogy, it was more like he was teaching at a university, whereas the previous set of teachings we could maybe liken to a high school. And a further difference was when Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma the first time, he appeared in the aspect of a fully ordained monk. But when he turned the wheel of Dharma the second time, he showed a divine aspect, an aspect of a deity. So he appeared in a different form. He had there were less people in his audience, and he taught here in the second wheel turning that all phenomena lack inherent existence.
아니 내게 셰싱이 도와서야 도 송아래 제가 당가는 주변에 누가를 사세죠 누가 사세죠 누가를 사세죠 제가 하디 제일이가 안지게 변에 회기 남바전지 지겨워 와다 하나신지 변에 지승하다 되네게 유행 지겨워 안 덴바샤게 두바데 두스티디 안에 결혼 남바전지 얘기도 와 최순간데 덴바샤게 두바래 누가를 하디 덴바샤게 두비 남바디 덴바래 제가 송서데 얘네 회유리야 송바 숨싸숨 회유리라 상여쯤데 누가 송바로 최송바라 제가 최년에 자사 하러 와데 한자 상여쯤데 남바디 클린 남바 코너 남바 된지는 마송하러 와 뉴 상여쯤데 데려와 제가 상여쯤데 제 두스치네 한 코너를 할이야 최송도 코너스 나신지 송고라지 밀이야 최송도 아주 미 남바 나시 된 송고로 와
We should include this in our understanding of the Buddha teaching the Dharma in accordance with the individual disposition and inclination of the beings before him, that he takes the physical aspect, or he appears in a physical aspect most suited for his audience. So what the physical aspect most suited for his audience of the first turning of the wheel of Dharma was of an ordained monk. But when he taught, for example, the Kalachakra Tantra, he appeared in the form of the deity Kalachakra. Sorry, not Kalachakra. I forget the Sanskrit. The English is the white umbrella deity. So when a Buddha Shakyamuni taught that Tantra, then he appeared in the form of that deity and taught that Tantra within a God realm to an audience of gods. So here he again appeared in the form most suitable to the audience before him.
난 추규 콜로코데 셰싱을 또 손들 갑라 안나다 다딩아도 셰라니 버든들 수메 자메 디메 로메 레메 최메서 디나신 야이 망치 디나시래 제가 가서 매매매 최탐이 라신 두버 요마랑에 챙이 두버 요마도 그냥 송거다 내 송거데 셰싱이도 가 최탐제 라신기 두버 요마를 배다돈 제외 채나 맞아 나난거도 라신 두버 난거 나와 나신 다신 제외서 라면도 두버 요마에서 뭐서 송해도 차상 동반 이견이야 송거래
In the second turning of the wheel of Dharma at Vulture's Peak, then, Buddha taught the sutras that are similar or in the same class as the Heart Sutra that we recite before class. So in the Heart Sutra, there are many negatives, no form, no feeling, etc. So we know from reciting it, there's this negative of no before so many terms. And what he's teaching here is that there is no phenomenon that exists inherently. There's no truly existent phenomenon. There's no phenomenon existent from its own side or existent by its own nature. There is no such phenomenon that exists in this way. And this was the topic of the second turning of the wheel of Dharma.
나 데네 소다데 제마 데네 양직 추기 콜로 숨보고 얘기 뒤실리에도 상유 추 송여도 데네 데려야 자주선바 다니 미기 메니기 치두주 두제데게랴 망부질랴 도과슬리고 그래 도과 가르리고 와서는 콜로 당비 숨위 갑려야 아니 예 송샤스 제가 덴바시 덴바시 남샤 송여도 안데랴 안지기 차상 미다바 예바다 다음에 바 차상 예비기 남샤 지랑에 챙이 주바 예바로 송샤스 다 셰징에도 콜로니비가서 최 탐제 랑신 주바 요마레세 송구도 와스 지난 디 책이데 삼다베네 녀마들 예바로 송 다데데 매 송요도 디니 가와 차기도스 로다 난가 차기도스 지난 상제라 노트 요마레스 가와 요마레스 지난 디니디 당보 송야 되나 타마 송야니데 가래를 고는 송바래 최탐제 랑신이 요마레 요마레세데 가르치는 송와레 딩이 도나 가르에서야 주의고 주의시바래. 네? 장주sem바 도나미야 장주sem바 지기야 도나미야다 파세 저디기 야 상질을 주의시바래. 다 메니기 체도지 두제기 삼로나래 차산 되는지 산이냐마 콜로 나비 송부깔 되네 송송. 콜로 바리 송부깔 되네 딩이데 가와라 차이도와 선배기 도과시 망고 여서와 지상 유디엔 장주sem바디가 킹고래 킹제는 장주sem바데 야 야샹시 야랑제 상유 줌네 데라 상유 줌네 네켜라 노트자와기네 요 말레스 매반자 상유기 당보 콜로 당비 숨비갑라 최담제 랑이 친이 여바로 송샤스 다 콜로 바위가서 최담제 랑이 친이 마두바리 송샤스 디니다는 가르레스 가네스레스 세나 안직 상이마 지기 야게 송로시에서 야 휴버로와 지산데 디기 렌송에 데라 디니치기 콜로 숨바세데 바와 친이 가서래 лябран намба чиги 콜로세디 치고 숨바디 송야디 치고 숨바디 거라이디 디시 데네 고바레 디가서 렌 송야디 치기 콜로 숨바디 차바레 janjusemba레 디체도 두자 디 코롱 두자 최 년비 갑라 다 데레 디니기 망고죠라 디가서 그래
After the two wheel turnings, some students had doubts. And bodhisattvas, with their great qualities, were aware of the doubts amongst a particular audience of students. And the doubt was that Buddha Shakyamuni, he taught in the first wheel turning about impermanence and selflessness, but that phenomena exist by the way of their own signs, or maybe better than signs, we can say characteristics. That phenomena do possess their own characteristics. But in the second wheel turning, Buddha taught the emptiness of inherent existence, in which means that phenomena do not exist by way of their own defining characteristics. So here is an apparent contradiction. The first wheel turning, it was taught that phenomena do exist by way of their own defining characteristics. But then in the second wheel turning, Buddha Shakyamuni taught that phenomena do not exist by way of their own defining characteristics. The Buddha, being perceived as a faultless being, here has taught contradictory teachings, or teachings which appear contradictory. So bodhisattvas, recognizing that in this particular audience, the students had this doubt and wanted this contradiction clarified, then they asked the Buddha to clear away this apparent contradiction, clear away the doubts of this audience.
지심 롭다기 롭생기 롭두기 롭두로지 디셰세 된디시에 바시 다음에 다등아도 콜로 바르비가 손예기 손세기 치두지베 두제디기 셰셀 마손에 이니 토름 랍다 유힌 셰세 첨부에 된지 셰세게 바지 다다다 콜로 바르비가 손예기 치두지베 두제디 다음에 이게 가서 된지 주바 죽지 중이 내내게 장한게 셰세 요바데 지바시 바와 끼마데 차고를 제가 먼저 가상 랍팅 타숨세디 체드집에 뒤에 시세텔 랍디 디에네게 콜로바르 체드집에 두자 안에 딩디 다데 콜로 타메기 체드집에 두자 디네 타마 디마디 안에 오마디 다데 콜로 당비 체드집에 두자 콘스숨 아두스체네 차송하래
To tie this, what's been presented here in terms of the wheel turnings to another analogy used last night, where it was mentioned that Buddha taught in accordance with the disposition of the beings before him. He taught in accordance with their mental capacities. Sometimes the audience had superior mental capacities, other times middling, and other times modest. So generally one would say within the first wheel turning, and then in the analogy last night we likened this to the need to progress through sequential trainings in our schooling and ending in university, and that this is required to become proficient in a topic. So we can liken perhaps the students who were gathered together to receive the first wheel turning as being at their primary school level of development, those who had gathered for the second wheel turning being at the university level of their spiritual development, and now those who had gathered together for what was about to become the third wheel turning, they would be likened to high school students in terms of their level of spiritual development. And this then we can also relate to the varying mental capacities of his followers. Now with the third, we'd say they were of middling capacity.
나 콜로스미 남자 캬바데 디체 다디네 자당한 저기 디시 좀다 시기 따르기디 상이기 아니 도텔에 템바이나 다 콜로스미는 도테 가르레 띵고레 사지 다 델레 띵고레서 딘마 순고레 카스딜린 주원이베디 렌디 도데 강라 템바니 제두 죽타 딘시소 딘시도 도소 콜로 담베 돌라 조르 땡징스 자 도데 강라 템바니 시드 제라마와는 도데 비그 좀티게 좀타디 따위 남샤디기다 아니 콘주게 도가를 콩두고라 상이 좀내디게 도가를 콩두고래 람나 딘시 최고라 콜라 담보 딘시 최고들라 안조 델레 콩두고래 해야지 대자 도서 콜라 담비기도 조르 땡지 델레 콩두고래세.
So looking at the text on page 3, the first part of the question, did the Buddha set forth all these different schools of tenets? Then that was answered in last night's class from looking at the first paragraph in the answer. Now we come to the second question. If he did, on what sutras do each rely? Now that answer we come to in the next paragraph. The sutras upon which each of the schools rely are as follows. The Vaibhashika and Sautrantika schools of tenets rely mainly on the sutras of the first wheel of doctrine, such as the Sutra of the Four Truths. So of the four different philosophical schools, the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika are the first two.
지산다 콜로 당부기 지산 제라마와던 되데바디기 콘조게 따르게 남샤던 콘조 람냠링이 림베 남샤데 차산 배조 공두세디 안에 콜로 당볼로 공두 콜로 당볼 공두 지산 콜로 당볼로 숨바 나신지 콜로 저기 냠는지 거래 지산 콜로 바르웨기 바왈 숨바 나신 호주게 바왈 숨바데 켈링고 마다 가지 켈링고 마다 콜로 당볼 숨바데 다 알아래스는 콜로 당볼로 공두 거래서지 대신 당한지 콜로 숨체베는 콜로 당보디 지산 다 콜로 당비기 체도 제비 두샤 라비오데 데 콜로 당비기 체도 제비 두샤데라 데 제라마와던 되데바 차고래.
The first, the philosophical tenets of the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika, they rely on the sutras that are included within the first wheel turning for their presentation of the paths to cultivate within themselves to spiritually develop and attain liberation. So when it's said that they rely on the first wheel turning, it means all their practices, all their philosophical view, as well as the practices to engage in to cultivate that view and transform their mind, all is included within the first wheel turning.
나는 저기 델리아 콜로 당보 다치도 지외 두지야데라 제라마와단 되데바 레스디 안달이야 안저기 지워르리기로와 다스 아니 상이 좀nen디고 콜로 담비 수비 갑려야 안디 제라 취행가 차상 제라마와단 되데바 장자레베스 안델이야 아니 샹다 요마레베스 아니 메나네 상이 좀nen디 콜 아니 자주센바다 디네기 망보여로와스 아니 지기 마디워리기로와 제가 덴디지 제라마 도데바 장자마다 샹다 요마레베스네 안 지워르 용시기로와 도가로 용시기로와 저 최슈가 상계 점nen디 디시 추유 콜로코디 최년가들 차상 제라마다 도데바 장야레베스 제라마다 도데바 마인게 우마바디네 최년가 요마레베스 데니게 삼술레시기로와.
So here it's quite easy to think that those who receive these teachings from the Buddha, those the sutra, for example, the Sutra on the Four Truths, were all of the philosophical persuasion of the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. There were no other students there, such as those who would later hold the view of the Middle Way. So it's quite easy to have such a thought that each and every student in the audience who received the teachings of the first wheel of Dharma was of the philosophical persuasion of the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika.
Chedo jebi duje de la jarama wadon de ba jang res lendi le chedo jebi duje de la kolo dambe chedo jebi duje de la jarama wadon de ba jang res ta chedo jebi duje ma bayan jere de ne kolo dambe chuen nyen kan duja ni jarama do de ma main ke shanda yo res ora.
The actual situation is the general audience of the first wheel turning of those sutras were Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas, the general audience, but not the entire audience. There were others in attendance who held higher philosophical views.
Shebe kabla yan chilo da tago ba de le ja kabla le de tos de nyen jorwa jesa de su ne di nyen ha na le yor de ne misu ka ne nga ju gi nyen shi shi gen shesa de chago marwa jesa misu che do jawa sa misu ka ne son sa sigur jesa de ni gi nyen ka na la misu ka ba mai ba sha da yung de ne misu ka son nga ju dirwa nga kabla le tago ba de le tos si nyen de di na yo ba nyen ka na la sha da yu de rwa di na shi ko sanye jumde denshi chuyu kolo sonsa miksu kare sonsa de da ma chedo jawasan koranzu ki chedo koranzu le songyor chizan sonsa de chera ma do de ba an de le ya da ya jingmi nyenken chuyu ken an di membe ge shanda ma wen gore.
Can understand this through our own situation here. So the class is presented for all of us. We are the intended audience. But we are also the general audience in that occasionally a visitor will come, maybe enter and listen for a few minutes, or stand outside and listen for a few minutes. So they'll hear a bit, but they are not the intended audience. They just happen to come here per chance. So similarly, the intended audience, the general audience of the first wheel turning, were those of the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika tenets. But there were others there who held higher tenets.
Niba sur that Namrik Kasore, that de la Colo Sumbagi son Shadwaniela, Namrik Basim Zamas, Namrik be Jumdanis, Dode Gomba, Ngela, so Colo Tamigi dollar, so dance. Just some somebody gave Tarugi, Namshadi, Sanji Yusung, and Cho Sunganania, so Karel Kuntu Gore Labna, Jazan Colo Bar, Colo Tama, that Dodi Control said. And
the text then continues. The Chittamatra school of tenets relies mainly on the sutras of the last wheel of doctrine, such as the unraveling of the Thought Sutra. So the first wheel turning was specifically for the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. Then the third wheel turning, or the last wheel turning, this was for the Chittamatran school.
Dizanda nanzo semzembeki Taiwan namsha zo di chiro dundu maruba rwa chiro dundu maruba and nidong says shigwa chizan tadi nidong said ini jarama wadon de debadigi kilingo mara nidong said chizan nidong sonya di garson was no kolo temiga so derwa the kolos katam dide tade ini kolo tabiga soyege Taiwan namsha di tawa de gasan gansa dame basu gansa rangyo tibi so maruba Kansa ranju tube chesu madhubadi da dame komya komche zo otiche de kansa ranju tube dame ba tobe lodi da lo tawa tardukche da tawa dele sheba che de yujen da yuniga yonsirwa chesa kolo dambe ka so karson so de medaba dunga tonga dame ba sungor dame ba seadi ranju tube chesu tube dama da do madhuba sungore chesa di da tawa yude deku tope lodi tawa tardukre se de jerama wadon de bage chesa kansa ranyo tube jesu maduba tobe tawa tardukre se ji kansa ranyo tube jesu maduba de topic danza dameba sede kansa rangyo tubi zesu maruba dameba je de topic lodi tawa tardu di gombala tene ta jajomba da san yugo bo thoyale tawa di gomba de topkure sede de jerama wa de de ba kelen dirwa sem zambi garasone di tawa tardume dile tawa yaga karre sende chirudu maruba 니동 se sura nidong de nidong to bige lodi tawa tardu di gombala tene ane sanyeda sanje ko ma to kure seje on go tu sungorwa di keling ma da de nidong le de chiro dondo ma ruba le ko jera ma de be chiro dondo ruba le ko wa
So for the proponents of the first wheel turning, the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, their view to realize is that of selflessness, namely that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. This is their ultimate view, or their supreme view, that according to their tenets needs to be realized in order to achieve liberation. The Chittamatrans, within their teachings comprised in the third wheel turning, whilst they accept that is the correct view of selflessness, they say that is not the highest of views that needs to be accumulated. One needs to be realized. One also needs to realize a subtler view, which is that phenomena are not externally established, the view of non-duality. The Vaibhashika and Sautrantika do not assert this view because they do not accept this view. They say external phenomena are truly established, whereas the Chittamatrans say that the highest view that has to be realized in order to achieve liberation is that phenomena lack external establishment, or the view of non-duality.
다 우마 바스도 우마 베게 줌다리 가와레 띵거라나 다 콜로 바와디레 우마 베게 줌다니 셰신 동자 자발라소 콜로 바위 돌라 조르데 덴바 인스
Then the text continues. The Madhyamaka school relies mainly on the sutras of the middle wheel of doctrine, such as the 100,000 stanza perfection of wisdom sutra.
지산다 우마 바디게 콜로 바와레 띵거레세 지산다 나조 가상 근데 줌다 마와시게 따주기 남셰데 안에 가솔레 산지기 손바나 산지기 도 가를 도데 가를 띵거레 세제 파지워와 나 디링데 도데 가를 띵거레라나 제라 마와나 도데 바니디 안에 산지 줌는데 콜로 당부기 덴바시 초콜 델리아 띵거레 델로 콩두거레스 델로 콩도제 따위 남자 케일은 거래제 아데네 우마바 세디기 안 따위 산지 줌는데 추이콜로 바와 추이콜로 베네 추이콜로 바와 델라데네 안 델라데네 콩두거레스 콩도 케일은 거래스 나 샘잠베기 안에 다 둠나 마오신에 샘 제라마와다 도데바 우마바 조서와다 샘잠바와 샘잠베기 따와 추가를 콩두거래라는 콜로 타마 안 도데 공제 도데라 데는 콩두거레스 델라 콩도 제상 코로조게 둠다마 제라마와다 도데바 니 콩두서 도 콩서 두서도 콜로 당바제 우마베 콩두서데 콜로 바와데제 안에 샘제베 콩두서데 콜로 타마레 제상 코로조 좀 되게 소소라하게 슝산지 도데 콩두서도 가가 자송로와.
So thus far we have seen the clear answer to the question above. If he did, on what sutras do each rely? So now we've seen in the answer that of the four tenets, the first two, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, rely primarily on the Sutra of the Four Truths. Then the Chittamatran school relies on unraveling of the Thought Sutra. And now we see that the Madhyamaka school relies primarily on the 100,000 stanza perfection of wisdom sutra. And we've also seen how these tie into the three wheel turnings, with the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika presentation being contained within the first wheel turning, and that of the Chittamatra being included in the third or the final wheel turning, and the Madhyamaka presentation, this being included in the second or middling wheel turning.
Isa da garesne sem zambada uma bani digi kolo dambo no sonya digi chasan konjugi kelingorwa denshi namjade kelingorwa an digala sem zambege gare kelingwa san digala ya an chiru dundu majuba asadi an ni dong asadi kelingore de di jera ma to de ba kemelen baje di kemelen baje da ni ine sem zambege chedamje rashi majuba asadi kelingo mare rashi majuba asadi kelingo chedamje rashi jubare la kore 나 우마바세디기 최담제 덴바 마두바세데 denshi ni kolo tambe kalo sumbe denshi da ke lingore kolo barwe kable sumbe ge nidong sia de desoya ke lingorwa digala ane kar sungorosne chue tamje demba maduba sia de odusine ke tawa namsha ke lingore sesna dinigi tawi ge korimno masona di shesel mason di ko to anza lobsel masona cheje chasongwa.
So then look a little more closely at this. So the Chittamatra school, they do accept the first wheel turning. But in addition to what is presented in the first wheel turning, they of course accept what's included in the third or the final wheel turning, which is that phenomena are not externally established and that the view of non-duality. So they accept the first wheel turning, and as well as the views of the second wheel turning. The Madhyamaka school, they also accept the first wheel turning. They also accept the view of non-duality, but they assert the emptiness of true existence. And I must start one point with the Chittamatrans. So the Chittamatrans, I'll repeat it all. They accept the first wheel turning. They also, in addition to this, accept non-duality and that phenomena are not externally established. But they do assert that phenomena are inherently existent. Madhyamaka, they accept the first wheel turning. They accept non-duality. And they uniquely assert the emptiness of true existence of all phenomena.
나 먼저 좀더 마와 실이야 안에 benenga 주기 녜중 짬로다 녜중다 안에 지게 잠니제 장주샘 진배냠는 추제냠는 쇠배냠는 존재냠는 삼대냠는 바도 차상 지바로 차고래 캬바라카요 말에 다 가르켜버렸으네 셔러기 냠는 집에 갈라 동 따위 남샤 될래 캬바 용거래.
These four philosophical tenets have a lot in common. They all assert similar teachings on refuge, on definite emergence, on the cultivation of love and compassion and attainment of bodhicitta, as well as the practices of generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, and concentration. All of these are accepted and presented. The difference comes in the view. That is the key difference between the philosophical tenets.
나가르 개발 쇼거스는다 제라 모던 되되벽이 가르sun 거스네 간사 다 랑게 튜베 제수 마드베 제수 마드바데 나 먼저 곰자 탈투디레 딜레하 요 말레스 제단디 또베로디 냠네지 곰바이나 타르바 토발라 디기 그 곰발레 톱투그레 안에 산지 고번 토발라야 다와디 곰발레 톱투그레 에시고라 지선 간사 랑게 튜베 제수 동 또베기 로디 곰발레 데네 아니 장주심 매바이나 장주심 냠네 마제바이나 타르바 톱투그레스 다디 또베 냠네 지도가 장주심 기군에 라지디 냠네 제바이나 산지 고번 톱투스 제자 타르바다 탐제기 산지 고번 토베기 따위 냠네 제디 간사 랑게 튜베 제수 마도바 또베기 다와디레스 딜레 하요 마레스 다 제라 모도디 바디스 킬링거와.
The Vaibhashika and Sauchantika tenets, they assert as the principal object of meditation the self lacking self-sufficient substantial existence. The self lacking self-sufficient substantial existence is the primary object of meditation for Vaibhashikas and Sauchantikas. And they say that it's this realization that leads to the attainment of liberation, freedom from samsara. And if the practitioner has in addition generated bodhicitta and is now a bodhisattva, their object of meditation doesn't change. It remains the same in order to attain enlightenment. So therefore, the primary object of meditation for Vaibhashika and Sautrantikas is the self-lacking, self-sufficient, substantial existence.
Samzambegi Karasungo Lamna, da Ranja Tube, Zesumadru Botu, Tawa de Gomba in Tarba top two gres, Sanyago top two mares, Chizan Tawa di Gomba, Sanyago top two mare, Chizan Sanyago Tawa, Tawa Karagomers, Nidong children do Madrubo Topi, Tawa de Gomores, di Gomba in the Sanyago top two gres, then conjugate Jeramawa Caso Ranja to be suited Tawa Chibu Gomba, Tarba top two gremado, Sanyago top two mares, Sanyago Tovala, Tawa Karagomers, Nidong to be Lodi Gomores, di Gombalet and top two gres, to Sumore.
Chittamatrans, they also assert that one needs to meditate on the self, lacking self-sufficient substantial existence. But this realization will lead to liberation, but only as far as liberation from samsara. So where they differ with the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, the two lower schools, is that this realization is insufficient to lead to enlightenment. And an additional object of meditation, philosophical meditation, is required in order to progress as far as enlightenment. And that is a non-duality, that all phenomena are not externally established. This view is required in addition to attain enlightenment.
Uma Niliguru, Uma Ranjubada, Uma Tenjubas, Nietzsche Hore. Jazanda Nietzsche, the Uma Ranjubasa, the Karasungorasene, the Semzamanashin, that Chiora, Kanza Ranja to be Zizu to be Dami, Tawa de Kolo Dambola, Sonshebe, Tawa de Combalatina, Tarba top two days. And Tarba Nyandu Judgment top two days, Nyandu Judgment top two days. Mother, and Ranja Judgmbada, Sanjo Gobasa top two mares. 다 샘잠베기 손셰비기 니동 세베 따와디 공발라테네 안에 가르콤도스네 안에 제데디 년제자 좀 받아 란제자 준비 자주면 니가게 가서 란제자 준비 되고 거 톱투그레스 이네 산제고 봐 따와 샘잠베 따와디 공발레네 산제고 봐 톱투 마레스 다 산제고 봐 토발라 덴바 모주바 토비기 덴바 모주바 토비 따와디 덴동 동바니 토비기 로디 공발레테네 안에 가 가소데 산요고바 토고데 지자 산요고바 토발라 동유도베 따와도 공부고레 세지 다 따와 탈두데다 동유도베 따와데 세지 근데 엄마 란주비기 디케링 거와 엔디로와
Then for the fourth school, Madhyamaka. So the Madhyamaka school has two subdivisions. So again, if you prefer the English to the Sanskrit, it's at the back of the book. But the two divisions of Madhyamaka are the Svatrantika Madhyamaka and the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So to look at the first of the two subdivisions, that of the Svatrantika, so they have their view has similarities with the Chittamatran view, in that the view of selflessness to be realized is that which was taught in the first wheel turning, that the self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence. So that they accept, but now the view comes a little bit more refined, because they say this realization alone is sufficient for a practitioner of hero lineage to achieve liberation, but only for a practitioner of hero lineage. For the practitioner of solitary realizer lineage, who's also striving for liberation, they need to additionally realize a subtler view, and that is of non-duality. So this then is a second object of meditation. But these two views on their own are insufficient to lead a bodhisattva to the attainment of their goal, that of enlightenment. A bodhisattva then has a third object of meditation, a lack of true existence. So the Svatantika Madhyamikas, they present three different objects of meditation which are need to be cultivated by practitioners of different lineages. Those of striving for the goal of hearer's liberation only need to realize that self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence, and those striving for the individual liberation of a solitary realizer also need to realize non-duality. And for those bodhisattvas who are striving for full enlightenment, they also need to realize the lack of true existence.
Now, Uma Tenju be Garasungorasene, Tapene, Uma Tenjuba. Uma Tenju be Garasungorasene, Chizan Ranja to be Dodebada, Kolo Dambolo Sumbige, Ranja to be Kansa Ranja Zizumaru, Tavi Namshadow Combalatene. Di combat samye tarba top to kumar tarbi ko top to kumar sanjo ko ba thoyal maje san tarba top to kumar es and the same zambe ke tawa and the chiru dundu to tongwa se de combat tene yang chi tarba to judgment ko ba top to kumar sanjo ko ba top to kumar judgment ko ba top to kumar 지난 judgment ba sanjo ko ba thobala and umabe tawa de mama to to be tawa de komo ko es da umabe uma tenjibe tumo mai ba charu ko ka Dembol Murube, Tombai to be Tawa de Combalatine, Judgme, Yanduedan, Ranjadan, Sanjokoma, Judgme de Botobala, and Sanjokoba Tobainada, Yandu Judgme de Botomnada, and the Ranja Judgme de Botomna Tawadi, Tombani to be Tao Comnamado, and Chenda, Tao Combalatine, and Totuma, Chesa, the Niki, Judgme the Sanjokoba Tobala, Nebardo, Tawadi, Tombani to be Tao Comure said, or do soon corda. Geshe me the Tomba in Dawa Salarua, that Tomba in Dawa, and think you for Tomba in Dawa, the Koni Caber Shayama.
Then the second division of the Madhyamaka, the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So here, the Prasangikas, they uniquely assert that the view of selflessness presented in the first wheel turning, that the self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence, that realization is insufficient to lead to liberation. It's only the Prasangikas who say that that realization is insufficient to lead to liberation. Moreover, they say that the Chittamachan view, that phenomena lack externally establishment, that view is insufficient to lead to enlightenment. What is required, but not only for enlightenment, for all three types of practitioners, the two types who are striving for individual liberation, the hearer and the solitary realizer, as well as the bodhisattva striving for enlightenment, all three require the realization of the same view, the view of emptiness. So they say, whatever one's goal is, whether liberation of either hero, solitary realizer, or Buddhahood, one has to realize emptiness. And it's only the realization of emptiness that can lead to the attainment of liberation or enlightenment. So here then, we've presented in brief the differences between the philosophical positions of the four tenets. I've only done so in brief. We've looked at this in some detail before and in great detail some years ago. And it's now the text has also presented the primary sutras that each of the philosophical schools rely on.
That kazan jiwa somebody bene Jumtegi, Davigi, Chomenda, Sapkegi, Dode, Lungla Tengu Rebe, Sachi, Lungla Tengu Rebe, Karating Tengu Rebe, said to Washiruada. and they did that that cousin because do this share mother near the answer Varanasi than near so share and do the tambo densi choga dine bawa shirching do dine tamadi and the jig sem labanamba to the share sarva. Jisan che to jive dujaladi that the colo dambe che to jive dujadi jeramawa do de baimba colo bari che to jive dujadel umabare colo tame che to jive dujadel semzabare se other tortushima shushan to semzabati jisan ko sonye du le masona and the tambo deji choga niba bawa Tenime choga tamalyabar number sem chorche, tamasumje, rimba sumje, cheji dujala, and you soon say you de la, down what the Varanasi, Casa down by the Varanasi, nibody, Jago Pumporich, somebody Yamba Cherua. That chedu dujade, down by chedu dujade, Joja Cheramo, Dodeva, Nibichi duja, Semtama, Akasa Umabachi, Sumbichi to Semtamachi, Dujege Chana Kaba DJ. Na, Taiwan Namsha Tawa Hartingores in the Tawadi. That colo tabicaso, Kansa Rangi to be Majuba to be Tawa Tingorova, Kansa Rangi to be Majuba, that Dame Bache, Dito Tawa de Tartu Direse. That colo Barricaso, Chetamje Ranching and Majubache, Temba Majuba, the Temba Majuba, the chair, Dito pe Tomba Temba Majuba, Dito below the Tawa Tartuche. That colo Tamicaso, Tawa della Anacasore, Chirudun Majubache, Dito pe Ulo the Tawa Tartuche. The
paragraph concludes, there are also ways of presenting the three series of wheels of doctrine from the point of view of place, time, subject, and those present. All of these are presented in the preceding segments. Place, of the three wheel turnings, the first was Varanasi, the second was Vulture's Peak, and the third was Vaishali. In terms of time, well, there's the differentiation between the first and the second and the third groupings of teachings. In terms of subject, well, in the first wheel turning was primarily that the self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence. In the second was that all phenomena lack true existence. And in the third, or of emptiness, or lack of characteristics, that phenomena are not established by way of their own characteristics. And then the third, the third wheel turning, that the view of non-duality, as well as that phenomena are not externally established. So they were differed thereby in terms of place, time, as well as subject. And then in terms of those present, then we spoke about that there were varying mental capacities amongst the students, amongst the audience. Those where the majority were either superior, middling, or of modest mental capacity.
That was somebody Drumdegi, Choman, David Sapkedi, and the Lula Tempa, Tengu, Lula Ten Haguribe, and Exor, Lula Tengu, Ribola Tengu, quite Sapke, Lula Ten, and then Sapke Cabra, the Hagur, Jaguribe, and the Ribola Tengu, Sachi, Casso, Tiva Chakore, Chada, the name that did you landed, then Marshiari.
Again, looking at the question, there are three questions included there. We've looked at the first two, now we come to the third. Does the difference of status and depth of the schools or tenets necessarily depend on scriptural authority? And the implication is, does it depend on scriptural authority or reasoning?
That didn't masungore. Drupta mitun begi, Davi Chomanda, Sapki, Kebra, Luna, Dine, Jequena.
And the text starts, if it were necessarily to differentiate the status and depth of the school's different views in dependence on scriptural authority.
Davigi and Chiki Chomanda and Sapkedi, Lula Dene Diries and Tacho Gubena, and then Gariungures and the Tacho Tugrives and Dicapores, Chizan Dodio Sosenes or Dodio Sosen Rangi, Danger, Lukte, Chodu Sumpe, Lungte, Temper, Gang Temper Scenes.
If it were necessary to differentiate the status and depth of the school's different views in dependence on scriptural authority, then, since the individual sutras each say that the system which it teaches is a superior system, one may wonder which sutra should be held as true. So in other words, confusion would follow if one relied solely on scriptural authority.
Judgment Tobala, Digum the Togure, Sanjo Goban Tobala, Digum the Togure, and Dilha Gonga Yomares, said the Kolo Davana Sunsarova. This one, and the Yashores did Tawatatu race a Sungrada. That in a Kolo Barrica so, Chetamja Ranji, Maduba Tobigi, Tombe Tomba Nidi, Gomja Tadure, De Tobo Lodi, Tomba Tobo Lodi, Gomja Tatu race, Tawatatu race, De Combalatene, and Sanjo Tarbada, Sanjo Goban, top 2 says Tawatadu regis Sonrua. Chetamja Ranji, Maduba, Tomba in De Tomba in Tobo Lodi, Gombalatene, and Tarba Togure, and Dajimito Togo, Sanjo Goban Togure, Di Gomja Tarture, Di Gomagombana, Sanjo Goban Totu Mare, says Colobarana, the Tawatadu Sonrua. And the nation same time began Chetamja, Chiro the Numaduba, Nidon Tobe. Lodi Tawa Tadure, Di Gombala and the Sanjo Goban Togure, Mado, Di Magomba, Sanjo Goban Totu Mare, says Di Nidon to below the same thing because Tawa Tadure and Colotamana Sonjarava. Jeza Konjugi, Jeramadan, Dunamawi, Dirty Big Tawa Tadutia, Sanjigi, Colodambana Sonja, Jeza Sanji, Colodambana Sundo, the Ganzu de Tawa Tadure, Garson Sanji, Sumba, Colodambana Sonson, Saji. And as it Uma Begidi, or the Ganju Tawa Tadu, the Ganju Tawa Tadu, Ganju, Garson, Sanji Sun, your Garson Colobarana Sun, your Saja. The Nana and some big on Tawa Tadu, Garson, Sanji Sun, your Colotamala Sun, your Chesa Sanji, Colo Duja Sosulia, Shun Sosulia, Tawa Tadu Sunja, and the Lunglet in the Tawa Tadu, Tawa Tadu Rem, Nit Yashur, Sapke Yashu Dires, Garson Lungle. Sundu Alabna and Lungar Kaling Restana, Cola Dambo Kaling, Cola Barwa Kaling, Cola Tamba Kaling, Sumba Sanji Sun Lungri was, and Sumba Nala Tawa Tartu Sun Shed was. Chesa Dene is a Lungla Dene and Tawa Tartu the Sapki, Keva Chegoena, Chegoena, Sapki, Keva Lungla Dene Chegoena, the dear Sosuene Radengi, Tenji Lung de Chodo Sumbe, Lung Gang Dembare, Gagidi Dembare. Colo Dambo Dembare Lagrebe, Niva Demba Sumba Dembare Lagores. The Zinima Loya de Dagare. Donda Discore.
This really is a valid confusion that can arise quite easily. Because if one, for example, reads the sutras of the Buddha or receives teachings, and it's a teaching in accordance with the first wheel turning, one will have presented that the very best object to meditate on is that the self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence. And it's through this realization that liberation and even enlightenment can be achieved. This is what you should meditate on. And who says this? The Buddha taught this. There is scriptural authority. Then one can attend a teaching that's in accordance with the middle wheel turning. And there one will hear, actually, it's that all phenomena lack inherent existence. This must be meditated on. It's only through realizing that all phenomena are empty that both liberation as well as enlightenment can be achieved. Therefore, this is the best of views. And this was taught by the Buddha too. But then if one attends teachings or read books that are in accordance with the final wheel turning, the Chittamatan view, then one will hear, actually, one needs to attain differing realizations in dependence on one's goal. Whether it's to realize that the self lacks self-sufficient substantial existence, that phenomena are not externally established, or the view of non-duality. These all need to be realized in dependence on one's specific goal. And this is the best view because it was taught by the Buddha. So the problem that can come is determining amongst these different views which is the superior one, because all were taught by the Buddha. Therefore, there is valid scriptural authority behind all of these views, because they were all taught by Buddha Shakyamuni.
lung chik denpa zinna deta mitin bi lung jishu de jidar ches. Tesa lung chik denpa zinda sido lung la tene denpa zingu yoba na kolo dangbo di dao de kolo dangbo soba denpa re la na kolo barwa da nipa ni de karachi ore denpa mare la ore bes. Denpa mare la ore bes. Di nashin kolo barwa di denpa re la na da kolo dangbo da tama nipo sunya di denpa mare la ore bes. 지산다는 콜로 타마데 덴바레람나 콜로 당보다 니베니디 덴바마레라 오레베스 지산 룽지슈 덴바르지나 대다 미튼베 지슈데 지데르 지에스 가르라 오레스 가르지 오레스 오레.
If one were to rely on scripture, solely on scriptural authority, one's confusion would continue. And we see in the next sentence, if a particular sutra were held to be true, one would then wonder how the other discordant sutras should be considered. So if one is relying on the, for example, the sutra on the Four Truths from the first wheel turning, how should one then relate to the sutras within the second and third wheel turning? Or if one is relying on the sutras of the second wheel turning, such as the 100,000 stanza perfection of wisdom sutra, how should one relate to the sutras included in the first and third wheel turning? And similarly, if one is relying on the sutra, the primary sutra of the third wheel turning, that of unraveling of the thought, how should one relate to the other sutras that aren't included in the third wheel turning?
lung la tin du bo na ta kholo dang bo di sim we de dem ba re chisan kholo ba wa dan ta ma ni sung ge de ta da ma re ne kholo dang bo so dem ba re ne ji de ne di dem ba yi gyum chen di rig bi che ba che ma ju lung la tin du ko wa da lung la tin ba na chisan kholo dang bo dem ba re ne an ni lung chi ko go ra an di kholo dem ba re san ye sung ye ge ya do chi ko go re de di dem ba ba de ya san ye sung ye ge do chi ko go re dene 파제는 너도 줘야 매대 상이 덴바레서 룽디 줘야 매바 차로 그래 제가 데네기 영화요 말했어요 그래 투메도 교 그래서 디나신 콜로 바와디 덴바레라바나 아니 콜로 바와디 덴바이 미김제 룽샨다치 고고래다 룽샨다치 상이 손시베 덴바레서 룽제 대한디 덴바이 바디 아니 룽루 콘도 야 룽지 고고래 바 룽제도 수제 룽디 줘야 매대 투야 매대 차로 그래서
The text continues, but if the system of the truth of one sutra and the non-truth of the others were necessarily provable only by scriptural authority, then the process would be endless. So here one can imagine a group of practitioners following different sutras contained within different wheel turnings, having endless arguments about which were superior, because all of them would be quoting citing the same reason, scriptural authority. And therefore, discussion would be endless.
제사다 룽라 때네 룽라 땐바 룽잠라 땐제 리버 베제마다제 룽잠라 땐제 룽짱짱라 삼다제 제베네 좀더 시기 남샤 따둑디게 삽케다 개발되게 하고 두고 말해서 하고 두고 말해서 룽짱짱을 때문에 룽점 리버 베제기네 마다제 삼로 그 리버 제바 마다 마제바제 룽짱야 수능을 송도 상예 송도 하시베 되네게 룽짱야를 베제 공도제 제베네 상이 좀티 시기 삽케다 안지 계셔되게 하고 두고 말해서 제가 룽들 투매 자루도 룽 제제제 룽지 아데 간sam질 룽라야 게면 되네 아니 디 공도서 룽디 되네 매가 차로 ben에 내가 저기 다제 점리 당보 차야 돼 가서 빅뱅에 중화서 빅뱅에 가서 중화서 되네 샤메를 받아 데르 투매 샤메와 차서 되네 김세 샤 부배 중에 김세 샤미도 디나진으로 차고 대 차로 그러와.
The point that is being made thus far in the paragraph is that only relying on scriptural authority one will not be able to differentiate between seemingly contradictory sutras, which means one will not be able to establish which approach to follow. Which approach to follow in that, should one be cultivating the views as presented here, cultivating the view as presented there, or cultivating the view as presented in the sutra? Because all of them can cite and do cite valid scriptural authority. So here, it's being, as the text said, it's being made clear that should one rely only on scriptural authority, one will not gain clarity. One will remain in a state of confusion, of endless argument. And this is similar, for example, in the world of science, especially with philosophical views trying to establish what it can only intellectually be, or primarily intellectually established. For example, that of the Big Bang. No one on the world today remembers it. No one was around observing it. No one's showing that video. But this has been established independence on reason, not just because someone said. So this is the key point that is being presented here.
나 안에 가르쳐 오래 람나 나는 좀 되게 삽케다 따위 남샤 되게 파 하고 야고시 하고 개발다 삽케다 지기 가르가르 하고 해야지 다 가르쳐 오래서는 롱델 송바디게 고고거든 저 르비제 바체 거래 삼로다 제바제 가르가르 송샤 데베네 콜로 담비가로 가르 송샤 송와디 체두지 두제 간지 송고도 뭐바다 감네 송사 간지 거바다 가자다 간지 콜로 바리 송야데 간지 송고도 제상 콜로 따위는 송야데 체두지 두제 송야데 파 제바지 심주체 안 송샤바 도르나 송샤바 나신 케멜레메 다하로 송바 나신 데니기 따따 레도미도 심주지 제바체고 르비 제바체 그래서 르비 제바체네 르비 제바체도 제바체도 르비 제네 네수도 하고 그래서 자산수수 하고 요도 되는 잡기 해봤다 하고 도래서 제 르비 제고 그래서 그러
So how then should one differentiate? Well, in addition to relying on scriptural authority, one must use reasoning. This is the key point being made here. So one uses one's reasoning, taking into account, as we saw in the preceding paragraph, the place that the teaching was given, the time, the subject, and the specific audience at that time. So using your reasoning in this way, as well as analyzing which of the varying views will actually lead to the goal that one desires, one will be able to establish with certainty which scriptures can be seen as having a superior presentation of the correct view, and which have present a differing view.
따위 초문 제비게 따위 초문 제바 리버니라 땡고 지나 따와게 따위 남샤 초면데 캬테라 마테 제바진 코스 삼노다 리버 제바 제제 리비 호 제바 리버 땡고마도 룽레 송샤 세바지 디자미에 타치정아도 제부 땡케바다 하고도 말이죠. 상기 송바나시 송바들 가르 송바디 디다가다 레드게 레미네 태기민도 제바지 리비 제바지여도 데네네서도 하고 그래서 제가 데네기 인자 어디 다와디 따다레샤 디다와 따다레샤 좀 하고 또 제가 리보 코나를 제바지 리보를 띵그레스 리보 니를 띵스 리보 코나라 띵그레스.
And this then is made in the next sentence. Therefore, the differentiation of the superiority and inferiority of views must rely only on reasoning. Maybe instead of rely only on reasoning, it should be rely on reasoning itself. That would be better. Therefore, the differentiation of the superiority and inferiority of views must rely on reasoning itself. And it's through using reasoning in relation to the differing presentations that one can come to gain certainty over which views are superior and which are inferior.
대치를 센디네 리바드 가서네 좀데 따르게 남자 초만디 더 룽잠라 때네 하고 두고 말에 그래서 매번서 리바를 때네 제바자 하고 고래 데네 인자 대치를 데네 인자 아니 태칭이 되되 Dodele Jewi Jange Jekobar Sung Sidi Teba Chimboge and Donalia Java Sanji Sun Shebigi and the Jigi Sun Mongola Lia and Pat Jangi Yawache de Sanji Sun de la Jeva Cheje or this one did that Sanji Sun or this one did Jantun Doresha. This one thing getting Doresha. Repeat Jevachine, Sanji Sun Jantegi, Dodang getting it in body, how to go at it. Repeat Jevachine, Sanji Sun Chasana, and Jiba Kelena, Kashiri, so Kasha Marison, Niga Kelena, Kawachagora, Deniza, repeat Jevache, and Jantun getting it to Kabache Warriors, Jangi Warriors.
The text continues, for that reason, the Mahayana Sutra set forth that it is necessary to distinguish what requires interpretation and what is definitive. So here, in order to differentiate between the many sutras that the Buddha taught, one needs to use reasoning to see which can be taken as presenting a meaning that is definitive and which is presenting a view whose meaning is interpretive. And the way to determine whether the view contained within a particular teaching of the Buddha is definitive or interpretive is to use one's intelligence, to use one's reasoning capacity for reasoning. And through doing so, one will be able to overcome the confusion that would otherwise result from relying on teachings that present views which superficially seem contradictory. Because it's difficult to rely on a view that is both definitive as well as a view that is interpretive. But through using one's reasoning, one will be able to differentiate between the two and thereby rely on those sutras which are definitive.
Dinegi Sanji Gala and Changi Chekugres, Songi do Tanganjugi, Sanji Jimnendigi. 당한주기 대기 주야다 동아세기 람기 남샤 냠낸 제하디 간치 오래서네 숨바점게 룽점라티네 마임바체 안파 지금 제바지 심주치 모인이 수데 퉁규데 눈미 퉁규면도 심주치 고 안에 모인이 수데 가림바데 자체체제 아 하고 와체 되나 하고네 되는 모인이 수동네 하고 손반 안디 냠낸제 안 곰제 안 동아세야데 디기주에게 탑람디레마도 안 산이 소바레스 나가랑 외니스데 심주 준예 맞제바제 산이 소바레스 이시짱바 되니기 몽데 이시 직부제제 안 제 냠내제요 말을 때인데 탈바든지 요거 도토야요 말을 때니서 산이 송샤바들이야 당보 퇴배 된데라 산이 송이 퇴배 된데 양내 양도 삼마다 리버베제 다 제바제 등외에서 튕기도 미도 제바제 도체는 의인이스 tumba chodi 가리용바는 파샤 되는 의인이스 tum비기 chodi 뭐네 이바디 이투 냠nen제 디곰 디야겠다 되네 전에 어저께 제발네 달바탐지 요거 톱투그리 해야지 나상이 줌는디기 최디 라왕 많이 냠nen제가 라왕다 제바지야다 차상직 두신의 유디겐지 차고래
The point then that His Holiness is making, is emphasizing here, is that in order to attain freedom from the sufferings of samsara, it's not sufficient to merely rely on the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni. One has to use one's own intelligence. So we're being strongly encouraged here not to rely on blind faith, utilize whatever blind faith that we may have as a basis, but we have to use intelligence and reasoning to to progress beyond a mere acceptance of Buddha's teachings, to come to integrate them within our own way of thinking, within our own minds. To do this, we have to use our own intelligence, our own reasoning. We have to use logic. And it's only through relying on our intelligence and using reasoning and logic that we will be able to spiritually progress and achieve liberation and enlightenment. So, the responsibility of each and every individual practitioner is to use one's intelligence and use it in the sense of analysis and investigation, in this way using logic and reasoning, to examine a view and see, is this view in accordance with reality? And as we're coming to recognize that a view is in accordance with reality, to strive ever more to integrate that within our way of thinking. This is the responsibility of each of us, because this is the way that liberation and enlightenment is achieved, not merely on blind faith, the mere acceptance of scriptural authority.
아디니 자 당한 저기 뒤로하다 뼈를 마선에 미가시 저게 잘해야 거부에게네 아니 고비다 오만 동야라 거부 메딩 지어로와 미가시 고비 동야라 거부이나 오만 동야라 자 동야라 거부 메딩 미가시 양직 자당 고비라 거부미데 오만 지구 동야라 거부에 용으로와 미직숨 용으로와 제가 되네 익숨들라 아니 미 저게 제겐디게 나지 어디 general kobi kahandel kobi te chakana chate omagna oma tigruwa za konozo meba shukche za konozo le dirwa da pite tang anzugi da mi shanda chileje tang anzu dina de tang anzulia chikari yagare sene 미소소나 되바 chene ko ragyorwa ina tang anzugi du 심주 chena 다 오마다 자다 고비 당 안zuli tuna ngāzuli sūpūli pēnduwa kārā yore, chēdēnda kārā pēngu wore, pēn dūshī shimshū chēchē, chēpa chēnā. Da dī nāne ngāzuli sūpūli mānyō bādē kārā yung kōrā sēpēki, dūshī chēpa chēnā, da dī nāne pēnyā jidāni, da ngāzuli kārā hā kūrā sēn, da dī tsēnrik bādāng, mēn bādāng, kēpa dīki, dīdī shimshū dā, dī tūna, sūpūli pēnduwa chē yore, sē shī kōrwa, jidān dūshī shimshū chē, khunzūki shimshū chē, chēpa chēnā, dīna hā kōrwa, dī dā chēdāna pēnduwa chē, dī yore sē 디네지네 담고르마도 어디 날디 동야 퀄리티 약고레스 제서 퀄리티 약고레스 차상 약고레스는 결혼도 약고 말에 게디 약고레라네 이게 제거라 디나신 차도 그래 뼈로스만 디로스에도 봐.
So if you think of when you have guests come to your home, we'll usually offer them something to drink and say, what would you like? Would you like some tea? Would you like coffee? Would you like it black? Would you like it white? And then your guest will respond and they'll say, I'll have tea, I'll have it white, I'll have it black, and so forth. So what's happening here is you, as the host, are investigating the needs of your guests, and you are responding in accordance with their particular desires, their own interests. Similarly, each guest, prior to this, they have investigated for themselves which they prefer. And they will investigate, and they will come to a decision whether they prefer tea or coffee or just milk, independence on their analysis. So their analysis, if it's done well, will be based not merely on their own wants and needs, but also take into account the research done by nutritionists or scientists, and who would identify what are the benefits of varying drinks, and what's beneficial, what's harmful, and independence on that knowledge. Then each person doesn't just blindly accept, oh well, I read that this is best, therefore this is what I will do, but they will do their own research, and they say, actually, if people say this particular drink is better, but when I drink it, it really doesn't suit me. I hear their advice, but I'm going to put it aside. This one seems to work better for me. And then their experience, taking into account those who are knowledgeable in this area, will lead them to come to a decision. So this is a similar process. Investigation is done by all, the host as well as the guests. And the investigation doesn't rely solely on the authority of others, but also on one's own investigation, and thereby gaining experience.
나는 나디링기 쇼게기 안줄롭센디 가르숭으로서나 다 좀티게 따위 남샤티게 안도 가르칼레 팅고레 세야데 나 콜로당 보당 바와당 타마 아니 제라마도데 바도수투 팅고레 세야다 다 콜로당 보당 바와당 아니 지게 타마디게 송야기 네디 유디게 네디네 송요레 세야다 아니 데네기 체도지위 두제 데네디네 요레 세야다 데네기 아나 따위기 따두기 남샤 디나네 미라데데 송요레 세데가 저기 쇼게 디고마 제슈 사거래 지나다데 아니 롱 따두기 삽키기 남샤다 초만이 캬바 사키기 남샤디 아니 롱라테네 제고르베 리발테네 로스네 롱라테네 두투 마레스 제바지 리바니라테네 리발테네 두고레 에세지 안다마가 저 다데티 저게 디고르시 사레 다니 뭐 잡로랴는 저기 되나 다 리발레 텐텐 두고베나 다나 리바 간에 삼당과 상여 좀nen디 간에 송어레스 다니스 간에 송요레 안딘마 안도레견 라소바드리 비게 제바체 다시 템바시 세데 송요 템바시 세다 어디 송요레 단 디고르마 쉬야지 근데 뒤에 니엘자 자데 고치고를 따야 주스라로와.
This morning then we've looked at the remaining components of the question. The first part of the question was answered last night and the second two parts were answered now this morning. So primarily we looked at how one should come to differentiate the teachings of the Buddha, coming to see which, in terms of the place where the Buddha taught the different wheel turnings, and what the sequence in terms of the time was, and then what the primary subject of each wheel turning was. And then lastly, then what differentiated the students present, both in terms of their mental capacity, their disposition, and so forth. So that was then presented this morning. And now finally came to the main point of this overall topic that we're at, which is the need to rely on reasoning, the need, or to express it differently, the need to think for ourselves, not just to accept what we are told, but to take that, think about it, use this intelligence. So this afternoon, we will continue on this point of how to use reasoning and logic in terms of what the Buddha taught in the Four Reliances. So that then concludes this morning's session. I've ended early, so at least there's time for some questions. So those who have questions, please ask.
Peter. On the next page, we have a quote from the Buddha, monks and the wise and learned, etc. And then we have a quote from Maitreya, which seems to support, the Maitreya quote seems to support the idea of middling, moderate, and superior views. Did the Buddha himself, in any sutras, say that he was teaching these different tenets in order to teach to different levels of students?
So I'll ask the question, if it's okay, just that last bit, because it's direct to what has been taught thus far, is did the Buddha divide his teachings into the wheel turnings, and specific and divided in terms of his audience, saying something along the lines of, these are for sharper faculty, and this kind of thing?
Or later on, in any sutra,
Did the Buddha himself, yes.
He was teaching to different
Audiences.
teaching those contradictory
yes.
views to different audiences.
Okay. So was there a particular sutra where the Buddha himself said that my teachings may appear contradictory, but they were taught in this way because of the audience at the time?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Dedi sanje jumda rangi songare, ngi song shabare, nga sanje res, za chimbu che, ngi songbare, kelin je kwaya mares, shimju che, jeba che, ane nguye ni su tungi dumi de jeba che kores, jeba che jen, jeba che ne, du shebe ne, ane de haku kores. Dedi tati nga nyingu jablo ligri.
What the Buddha did teach is this verse at the bottom of the third page, which makes the point that you must think for yourselves and take my teachings, not just blindly accept my teachings because I am the Buddha, I am the awakened one. You need to use your intelligence. So this is what the Buddha taught. Okay. George?
Could I please have a definition of, or another definition of non-dual?
Okay. So what is the meaning of non-dual?
What is non-dual?
Okay.
Ni don't let that do sre. Tangazuli chilu suksik na do chiru dun to bat nangore. Now on I sent you your besine, the Omar Hesere. Isam ni ale that de one shiki su zimbi tema dedan, su zimbi tema nise di nise. Ni di koni deme dunshen tade bachile besine, the mares, Java Uni Medigan. Java Uni Medigan tade bachile besine, the name mares, chiru yudan. Suktan, Detsimbe, Tsema Nibodi, and now do Konye Tade Janchi Nangore, Javameva Nangore. Now I did not send you Yomares or Dele Niton Sigore.
The non-duality, or the duality, is between subject and object. The object being, for example, the external form, the object, and the subject being the valid cognizer apprehending it. So these two appear to us as having no relationship between them. This is how they appear, as dualistic, that we have something here being perceived by something here. So there's not a relationship between them. And this then leads us to believe that the way phenomena appear to us is how they exist. Whereas when one investigates, we see that there is a relationship between the two, and therefore phenomena do not exist in the way that they appear, and therefore, whilst phenomena appear, whilst there appears to be dualism between subjects and objects, there's non-duality. So like that, it's the technique to realize that phenomena do not exist in the way they appear. Okay. Camilla?
Yeah.
Last night, Lama talked about temporary and ultimate antidotes to afflictions, specifically yesterday was anger. I was wondering if Lama could talk a little bit about how to guard against the feeling of repressing those afflictions, or even feeling like you're being dishonest when you're applying those antidotes.
So last night, some temporary antidotes to anger were presented. So in terms of anger or other afflictions in general, can say something about how we can guard against the feeling of not being sincere with ourselves when we apply those antidotes. It's as if we are repressing the antidote, repressing the afflictions, and therefore not being true to ourselves. Dinegi ma nyona di neutral de. Kareza dadun tingla yode. Dadun tingla yode. Dene yankya yo. Dene lung sapo ina lung sapo me sosoran la. Lung sapo me 이름을
yore di yungurwa 가서네 댕이 가상시에데 내갑들이야 강아트도 마시에게 탑람식 셰르마도 그매 덴지 자원 매와 수투야 말고 그 투야 매로 하다 제산 자원 매와 마서 와산 딩라 거의 슈기 뉴바디 여자 kiến 태도 남살리 연구로 kiến 되스기 남살리고로 제상 안주기 도시에 권리기대 제상아주 자원의 마요에게 삼단 쇠디 매와 쇠디 갔다 때에 남자 검지 매와 쇠가 되래서 뜻으로
So take a couple of ways to look at this. Firstly, we recognize the arisal of the affliction, as opposed to dismissing this about oneself. Also recognize that the temporary antidotes are only that, they're temporary antidotes. So with this then is the recognition that temporary antidotes, in a sense, only suppress, they do not eliminate. They will temporarily eliminate, but the affliction will continue to arise. So whilst one needs to apply the temporary antidotes, because they are much easier to apply, so as to gain peace of mind again and prevent the accumulation of non-virtue, we also then need to move on to cultivating the ultimate antidote, not merely or not only the temporary antidote, which is to cultivate the correct view. Because it's through the cultivation of the correct view that the afflictions will be severed and never arise again. And in this way, we won't be suppressing, but we will be actually eliminating. Okay?